Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance along the Serbiansky forest area in the eastern parts of Liman to the north of Pokrovsk, advancing both in the north of Rodinsk, counter-encircling Ukrainian forces counterattacking in the area, as well as advancing to the east of Mirnorad, further securing their positions on the eastern flank. The Russians also managed to advance within the second line of defense here in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Stepove and additional parts of the second line of defense, the fortifications, as the Russians continue offensive operations along the second line of defense to gain control over Verbove, the fortifications in the area, and advancing in the direction of the river line here, the Yanishur River, which spans from the first line of defense to the second line of defense. Aligning the front line with this river line significantly strengthens their positions in the first and second line of defense, before moving on to the remaining fortifications along the river line and cutting off the highway to the north, which will limit the supplies going to the Ukrainian forces in the area in the vicinity of Hulyaipole, and spread out the supplies going through Hulyaipole to not just cover the southern and eastern flank, but also the northern flank, where the Russians, with a penetration through the river line, can bypass the remaining parts of the first line of defense and enter into Hulyaipole through the northern route that we see here along the rear of the first line of defense through this road and down into Hulyaipole. So the advances by the Russians here along the first and second lines of defense are reaching a critical point, because if they're able to breach through the defensive line of the Ukrainians here north of Hulyaipole, then the Ukrainians' positions in the area becomes seriously compromised, and the Russian capture of this entire area will lead to a significant breakthrough in favor of the Russian forces, which will allow them to develop offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region from the south, gaining control over Hulyaipole as a major logistical hub for their forces for offensive operations along the remaining parts of the first and second lines of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia region, and to solidify their positions and gain access to additional logistical hubs within this section of the front line towards Pokrovsk and the very rear of the Zaporizhzhia region. The Russians also managed to advance here to the east of Pokrovsk, gaining control over several fortified positions here to the west of Novoekonomishne and re-entering the industrial zone, where the Russians are almost in full control over everything east of the Dragon Teeth and anti-tank ditch lines here to the east of Mirnorad. These advances significantly bolster the Russian offensive capabilities in this section of the front line and solidifies their control over the western bank of the Kaseni Turets river line, and will allow them to focus their forces further south to gain control over the settlements of Belahan, Kosatske, and Promin here on the eastern flank of Mirnorad, and connect their forces between Hrodivka in the south and Novoekonomishne in the north on the western bank of the river line, significantly bolstering the supply capabilities of the Russian forces to the east of Mirnorad and to the north. But the Russians, with this counterattack here, managed to gain control over Voykivka and fully secure the settlement and the fortified positions on the outskirts of it, and also to push the Ukrainian forces down out of the northern parts of Nikolaevka and pushing through to gain control over Doreshne as well. This allowed them to cut off the northern flank of the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth lines, which means that the main supply line for the Ukrainian forces has been cut off. And not only that, they've also managed to cut off any supply line that does not go through these defensive lines. That means the sole supply line of the Ukrainian forces is a few tiny gaps in these anti-tank ditch and Dragon Teeth lines, which means the operational encirclement of the Ukrainian forces here west of Voykivka is very significant, and it is likely that the Russians will gain full control over everything east of these fortifications if they're able to hold Doreshne, which will completely secure their positions further north. And with their recent advances to the west and east of Shakhove, the Russians may also soon operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces counterattacking to the north of Penkivka and Novotoretsk, which will completely reverse the situation here to the north of Pokrovsk and allow the Russians to solidify their positions on the northern flank, gain control over the area south of Novoekonomishne and the area here to the north of Rodinsk, will significantly bolster the Russian offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities in the area. Further gaining control over Shakhove will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in the direction of Dobropilya, strengthen their positions around Rudinsk for the siege of the city, which will then allow the Russians to cut off the northern supply line completely, and with the infiltration in the western parts of Pokrovsk, they'll be able to physically cut off all of the main supply routes into Pokrovsk, leaving just a few inferior secondary supply routes into the city, which will be under Russian fire control, which would mean that the city would be operationally encircled, not just Pokrovsk, but Mirnorod as well. With this single advance on the northern flank of the Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians may be switching the situation around, where previously it was almost on the path to disaster. The Russians are slowly turning the situation around, and if they're able to solidify these positions and double down on these gains, then the city of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod will end up being in a very critical situation where the Russians can gain a decisive advantage. In the northern parts in the direction of the Serbiansky forest area, the Russians have regained full control over Serebrianka, captured some fortified positions on the outskirts of it, and gained control over the roads to the south. Russians are storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, which are now operationally encircled, and with the Russian presence in the residential area to the west of Serebrianka, following their passage through the Serbiansky forest area across the river line and into the northern flank of the Donetsk region, Ukrainian forces have been encircled. Some of them have withdrawn, while others are being fought here in the residential area near the Dreamwood area here to the south of the Serbiansky forest area. So from this we can see that the Russians have significantly broken down the Ukrainian defensive line in the area and are now pushing in the direction of the Bakhmutovka River to gain control over the eastern bank of it and the northern flank of Siversk to cut off the supply lines in the area and reach into Siversk itself from the northern flank, bypassing the defensive lines while capturing the northern flank. The Russians will now likely push through into the Siversk direction from the northern flank and eastern flank, as well as through the flank of the fortifications to gain control over the remaining fortifications, to gain control over the town itself, and to gain the advantage in this section of the front line. Gaining full control over the Siversk area will allow them to align the front line with the canal in the western direction, all the way down south towards the Sloviansko-Shensinivka line, and with the progress in the direction of Liman as well, the northern and eastern flank of the Sloviansko-Shensinivka line will be aligned with the current front line along Chasiv Yar, Teretsk, and Poltavka here to the southwest. From these developments all throughout the front line, we can see that the Russians have managed to gain a significant advantage across the front line, turned some terrible situations around, and the Ukrainian counterattacks were simply not powerful enough to turn the situation around. Zelensky is still keeping a lot of offensive capabilities in reserve, which are not being used for these defensive operations, but will instead be used for an offensive operation in the coming days, weeks, or months. It is unclear when these units will be put to use. The Ukrainians are preparing the intelligence and the weaponry for such an operation, while the manpower has been prepared. So it can happen at any time now, depending on the moment, on the strike of opportunity the Ukrainians are looking for. They've gotten their approval from the United States and from Europe to launch this operation. It will likely be one similar to the Kursk incursion, whether it will happen in the Kursk, Belgorod, Bryansk, southern section of the front line, or even a crazy operation into Belarus. Who knows? I'm just suggesting what he might be doing. There's also been some reports about Ukrainian special forces operating in Moldova along the border to Transnistria. Anything could happen. Whatever the Ukrainian operation planned is, they will be pulling it off at some point, while the Russians continue to advances along the front line, where even at the current pace that they are taking through 2025, the first 9 months from January to the start of September, if the Russians keep up this pace, they will gain full control over the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions within 4 years. If you also include the territory captured or recaptured in the Kursk incursion, it will be 3 years. So we see that the situation, in accordance with the obvious trend, the Russians will gain control over the annexed territories, even if there is no collapse of the Ukrainian army. Simply by the situation staying as it is, If the Russians are able to speed up the capture of territory, or if the Ukrainian positions collapse, then it will happen even sooner. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.